This is the Brave New Coin Crypto Conversation, hosted by Andy Pickering.
Hi everyone, Andy Pickering here. I'm your host and welcome to the Crypto Conversation, a Brave New Coin podcast where we talk to the people building the future in the Bitcoin, blockchain and cryptocurrency space. This episode is brought to you by BNC Pro, the brand spanking new digital wealth platform featuring an all-in-one suite of customizable institutional-grade applications that help you manage your crypto investments. Yes, research, chart, screen, analyze, optimize, report, and more. BNC Pro is the ultimate portfolio tool for individual or enterprise use. Streamline your workflow, manage your crypto, and master this brave new asset class your way with BNC Pro. Go to bnc-pro.com now to create your free account, or just look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Now, on with the show. My guest today is Steve Vallas. Steve is the new Chief Executive Officer at Blockchain Australia, which is the industry body that represents and supports Australian business professionals, startups, industry and education sector participants in the blockchain sector in Australia. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Andy.
Now, Steve, you're based in Melbourne, I think, which of course is one of Australia's big cities, and one of my Brave New Coin colleagues is also in Melbourne. His name is Pantelis, and it was actually Pantelis that connected you and I. So, hey, quick shout out to Pantelis and also to yourself and really everyone in Melbourne. Because as I understand it, just last night, Melbourne has gone back into lockdown. What's going on?
We are the problem child on the nation at the moment, Andy. Unfortunately, the decision to shut us down for 6 weeks was announced yesterday. So I think a lot of people who are otherwise planning to start coming out of their bunkers, unfortunately now have been asked to stay in them for the next little while. So I think there'll be another period of transition, unfortunately.
Yes, the pandemic just shows no real sign of slowing down, and there's a lot of hotspots all over the world, really. Yeah, sad to see. What's your actual background, Steve? Because as I understand it, you have a reputation as the blockchain go-to guy in Australia, but what were you doing before you became CEO at Blockchain Australia? What's your background?
It's a long and varied history. I think sort of the important parts for the purpose of the community now is, a long time ago I was a lawyer, and I think notwithstanding the fact I didn't practice for a long period of time, I sort of tend to understand the way those sorts of rooms and offices operate. So that's a historical context. In the last 10 or so years, I really became interested in social channels and digital strategy and the like. So I taught myself a lot about those channels, and it morphed into a business. And I found myself initially giving advice about strategy and how to use channels to communicate messaging. Accidentally, over a period of time, that expanded, and I've been describing myself effectively as a management consultant by stealth in the last few years, where it starts with a conversation about what people might be wanting to do from a perspective of communications, and then it ends up being fundamentally a business conversation, what people's businesses are, what skills they have, what resources they have. The interest in the blockchain space started probably 3.5, 4 years ago, where I found myself in a lot of rooms where people profess to have skills about the space, and I thought it's very hard to distinguish. And the blockchain conversation for me was particularly interesting because I thought this is difficult and it's going to take some real learning for people to grasp it. I like the fact there was effectively a moat between those who took the time to understand this space and those who don't. So I sort of dove into it. And in the last 3.5 years, I think part of the reason why people have been kind enough to consider me a player in the space is because I just show up to stuff, Andy. I've been to hundreds and hundreds of events where I sit in rooms just to get a sense of who's there, who keeps showing up, who's diligently sort of working away. So over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been able to do that and continue to earn a living doing other things. So I kind of feel a little bit like a clean skin in that regard. I haven't had to shill a thing. I haven't had to compromise anything by taking work in order to make ends meet. And so it's just afforded me, I think, a lot of luxuries. People have come to trust that I'm happy to express an opinion in a room, even if it's not necessarily the opinion of choice by everybody in that space.
Sure, and that's interesting, Steve. You know, a country the size of Australia, which is kind of, you know, small enough that I think you could, you know, I love that idea of, you said you just go along to these events and show up, which is kind of, I guess, you know, on the ground, in-person networking, which takes a little bit of time to pay off, but that's a really powerful way of establishing yourself, and it particularly works in a new industry such as, I guess, crypto or blockchain, right?
Absolutely, and I think the passage of time is the great determinant for me of people's ability to survive in this space. I think I've met a lot of great people who've been under enormous pressure because of their commitment to this space. If money doesn't come easily, then it's a big ask to get people to show up month after month and year after year. And a lot of people in this space manage to do that, which is why I love the sector, is because a lot of people, this remains a passion project after 2 or 3 years. And there aren't a lot of people I know in industries and sectors that aren't blockchain related where people are willing to keep their own dream alive because they have a real belief in where this technology is going.
Yes, indeed. That's exactly right. Well said, Steve. All right. Well, tell us, what exactly is Blockchain Australia, and you know, what's the purpose of the organisation, and what was your path to becoming the CEO? Did you apply, or were you invited? What's the background here?
I think it was kind of a combination of both for me, Andy. I've been around the space for so long. It's funny that as the peak body, and BA acts as the peak body, it's representative of its members, and it seeks to be the voice of the broader community, and it seeks to advocate on behalf of those voices. I've deliberately not been particularly involved in the organisation because I know that my approach historically has been a little bit different to the organisation's approach. Mine's a broad-based view. I mean, I'm generally of the view that rather than getting people under the tent, I like as expansive an organisation and a community as possible. So whilst I've gone out and happily been able to have conversations and build relationships with people without the challenge that is running an organisation, the need to fund an organisation, it's afforded me sort of different opportunities. I think one of the key things was 3 years ago, I went to a conference that I had no place in being. It was in Shanghai. I convinced my wife to go on the first holiday we'd been on for years and years, and it was for me to go and sit and listen to Vitalik and Nick Szabo and a few others on stage talk about what this promise was. That sort of set me on a path where I think 2 years ago, I ran an event called the Blockchain APAC conference, and it was deliberately timed to entice those who had a focus, not on the crypto side, but more the enterprise side, the recognition that you need them in the room to talk about some of the issues that are of interest to them. That was 2 years ago. A year later, last year, I did another event where I invited 100 people into the room that was representative of industry, government, devs, education. They all sort of came in, and effectively I've said, listen, we're now a maturing industry. There's a conversation that should be had across all of these rooms, notwithstanding what people's views are about where the tech should go or what protocols are the winning sort of protocols in the future. That's been the path. And then I found myself aligning with where BA is and my view of what the organisation should be, which is fundamentally it should serve two purposes. It should advocate and it should elevate. And the elevation for me is the elevation of community members. And I think if we can elevate the industry, the voices, the people that are showing up day after day, then it creates a greater capacity for people to listen to what the views of the organisation and the community are. So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we elevate the people in the community, the greater the likelihood that we can advocate on behalf of those people.
Yeah, look, that makes a lot of sense. And look, I happened to see a post on LinkedIn by yourself, or perhaps it was from Blockchain Australia, but was talking about your announcement as the new CEO. And I think you said that the first thing you wanted to do was focus on building up confidence in blockchain and also improve the image of blockchain technology among businesses and governments. And, I think that also makes a lot of sense because, well, you tell me, I mean, why do we need to build up confidence in blockchain? And what are you saying? Does blockchain have a little bit of an image problem, do you think?
I think the legacy of 2017 and 2018 and funding that came readily for some projects and some projects that in some people's estimations didn't deserve the funding. I think a lot of people formed a view of what the ecosystem was a couple of years ago. And if you try to talk to them about what the ecosystem is now, and it's very different, they still got their arms crossed, Andy. They just sit there and think, no, I've looked at it, it's not a thing. And I've said to them, I'd revisit it. There's a lot happening in the space, and a lot has happened in the space. And we know that the flows that are the easy money, so-called, that sort of came through, they've come to an end primarily for projects as well. So I'm asking people to revisit the view, if they'd formed one and they haven't moved on from the last couple of years. So that's part of the sort of rehabilitation for me. I don't think there's fundamentally an issue. I think a lot of the people who've described the space as scammy or otherwise, I've said effectively they're startups. I mean, no one goes into normal startup ecosystem rooms and points to people and say, you're all a bunch of scammers. What they say is these are ideas, and sometimes they're poorly funded and sometimes they're poorly executed, and people are comfortable saying fail fast in a more traditional startup room, but they don't seem to afford the same luxury to people in the blockchain DLT space. So I'm saying, well, we're back in line. We judge us according to the merits of the project today. And if you don't think it's a great project or you don't think you should fund it, then that's fine. But don't judge it by some criteria that you don't apply to other startups in a variety of other sectors.
Yeah, look, I think that's very fair. I suppose, Steve, it's also, you know, from the layperson's point of view, you know, there's that famous quote, you know, from I think it was what's his name, John Oliver said, you know, Bitcoin is everything you don't understand about money, along with everything you don't understand about computers, something like that. And it's kind of, you know, so people, as soon as you put sort of money into the equation, it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around the idea of digital value, and that's kind of the chasm that people have to cross to really begin to understand Bitcoin, and then blockchain, of course, as well.
And I think part of the challenge that I'm finding, Andy, when I'm going into rooms is we have people that are in some ways either sort of they're budding in their interest in the space, or they might be true believers. But when you leave that room, they're left to then go into their own organisations and deal with their own stakeholders and communicate the same message. And that's the challenge. It's not about convincing one person. It's trying to get some sort of tipping point within an organisation. And that is the difficulty, because those that like the space love to talk about it. We talk to each other about it all the time. We talk about all the implications of everything that's happening, but they're not conversations that are happening en masse within organisations. I think that's what people forget. You know, if you've convinced one person, you know, the whispers that are, can you go back in and tell the organisation? I recognise when I speak to larger organisations and they say, you know, who do you need to speak to? What's the pitch? And I tell them, well, I'm probably going to need 4 whiteboards and I need 4 departments, and I don't ever want the departments in the same room at the same time, because they all have different agendas. But I can speak to the marketing department about what it might mean. I can speak to the resourcing department about what it might mean. External, internal stakeholders, they're all separate conversations. And I think that's part of the challenge for individuals. They tell one story from one perspective, and it's just not enough to get people over the line, because you're asking them to revisit processes that work fine. They're okay. And if you're going in there to ask someone to take a legacy system out and put this in, you're going to find difficulties. So this is an iterative process for me, which is the reason why I keep showing up to rooms, because I figure if I can build confidence a little bit at a time, at some point in time, we do hit that tipping point.
Okay. Well, look, hey, I hope we do see that tipping point. So, look, Steve, it's one thing to be talking to, I guess, you know, companies and startups and firms and businesses and stakeholders, and, you know, as you say, you've got to grow the confidence one step at a time. But, you know, governments are another kettle of fish again. So, you know, regulators, bureaucrats, administrators, and, you know, I saw that the Australian government released a national blockchain strategy, or a roadmap, I think in February of this year. So I've had a little look at that, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it yourself. But so before we dig into that, sort of, yeah, I mean, what's it like sort of trying to engage with government officials, and is that part of your role?
It is part of my role. It's something that I've done over the last couple of years, and I think, again, a misapprehension that people have when it comes to government is there is a voice, there is a view, and there is a voice. And the reality is there are individuals within departments that don't speak to each other across states and federally. So it's not this monolith that people view it to be. So again, this is an exercise in lots of conversations to try to understand people's context. So from a government perspective, the roadmap was released in February of this year. It was received relatively well by some sectors of the community. Others sort of lamented the fact there was no funding that was put against it. My strong view is I'm glad there was no funding put against it, because who would you fund first? And that's part of the challenge, Andy. There are lots of people that would deserve, warrant, or demand some funding. So this for me is the starting point. And I thought critically from a federal perspective, it's important that the federal government is signalling for the purposes of the federal government and also for the purposes of state governments that this is a subject matter that they're looking at. So I was ecstatic that it happened, and I'm okay with people criticising it, because what it does then encourage is people to offer views about the direction that we should be taking.
Again, nicely said, Steve. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Australian National Blockchain Roadmap, and the subtitle is Progressing Towards a Blockchain-Empowered Future. So it all, great title and great subtitle, but the danger with these kind of documents, of course, is, governments, they pump these kind of documents out, and sometimes things get done, and sometimes you get the idea they just probably go into a top drawer and no one reads them. Yeah, what's your take on this?
I think importantly, they had to pick a starting point. They've done that. They deliver a document. The document is an important marker because it recognises that it's subject matter that they want to speak about. They've chosen 3 initial use cases in a broad sense, and the use cases are supply chain, their education, micro-credentialing, and they're also dealing with issues of AML, CTF compliance. They're broad conversations, and for me, that's the framework. And unsurprisingly, in the supply chain has been, I think, an in plain sight opportunity for businesses and for governments for the last few years. So it's a natural place to start. In this context, particularly in a COVID-19 environment, it's kind of like they picked the right places to start, because the truth is we're seeing supply chain breakdowns. We're seeing integrity of these processes that are critically important to Australia being reflected in supply chains and ultimately potentially improved through blockchain technology. So timing is everything, I think, in relation to this. From the education perspective and the micro-credentialing perspective, there's also issues of identity and how we process information. I look at it and think about the last few months where people have had to queue up in order to get some benefits, and they have to verify who they are, over and over again, and sit on the line for hours. Again, suddenly there's a connection that probably didn't exist for a lot of other people historically that can be made when you talk about blockchain DLT technology. Because if I ask you, would you be happy to be verified very quickly with certainty if you could press a button? Then the answer is, of course, I'd rather do that. So it's easier to make the connection between this technology and what we're experiencing in this sort of COVID-19 environment. So they're the subject matters broadly that we're commencing with. And now that is in plain sight, it's my understanding now that the Department of Industry will engage individuals and ask them to come forward and seek to participate in the development of this particular conversation and in the committee that has been established to further this blockchain roadmap development. So it's an opportunity for people to put their hand up now, Andy, which is something that people always say that they're not consulted. Well, the consultation process is commencing. So I think in a very short order, you'll find that the government says, who wants to talk about it, who'd like to participate? And I'd welcome as many people as possible to put their hand up, just to show, if nothing else, that there's a real appetite to have this conversation from community members.
Yeah, well, look, that sounds really encouraging and really positive, Steve. And, the report, I think they said that blockchain technology is predicted to generate an annual business value of US $175 billion by 2025 and up to $3 trillion by 2030. So if you're saying that they're opening up submissions for people to get involved and perhaps look at ways to perhaps provide solutions to those 3 areas that you've outlined, which is really what supply chain, user digital identities, and KYC AML. Is there funding set aside for any kind of trial projects or anything like that, or is it just expressions of interest? What's the process?
So the expression of interest is those who seek to participate in the development of the subject matter around those respective sort of committee elements. So those who are volunteering information about what the supply chain process should look like. So we're very early in that regard. There's no funding against projects. They'll be asked to report back to the government, and ultimately these submissions will form the direction. So effectively, I view it as putting meat on the bones. So the spine that is the information included in that roadmap document. Now we go into the community and say what's important, what works, what opportunities can we find. And I think fortuitously, timing is everything again, I keep saying. The Prime Minister mentioned blockchain a week and a half ago. The Minister for Industry mentioned blockchain in question time. And they started, I think, with a subject matter that makes sense to a lot of people, which is efficiency and process. Now, and it might be boring, but the reality is most industry is boring by most people's estimations, but it's functional. And it helps, I think, the narrative that is, this is an infrastructure level technology. So notwithstanding some of the fringe and use cases that are really interesting about what they mean for finance and the like, and the digitization of all sorts of assets, fundamentally there's a conversation about efficiency, which is much easier to have within government, and it's much easier to have within large scale businesses. So I think that's a good jump off point. And the fact that it's put on and has been put on very recently the national agenda is encouraging for me.
Yeah, look, again, as I said, encouraging and positive. I just couldn't help but feel when I was reading the report, and this probably, it probably speaks to my own personal bias, and, anyone in the ecosystem will have that same bias, in that, you read the report and it just feels slightly underwhelming and perhaps a little bit dry and not particularly ambitious. And I suppose that's simply because it's coming from a government, whereas if you're actually in the ecosystem, it's a little bit easy to actually, fall on the other side of the spectrum and perhaps get too carried away by ambitious ideas that are not really going to play out on the kind of timelines that people perhaps have promised in the past. I guess what I'm getting at is, is there a danger with governments like the Australian governments? And I wouldn't want to pass, I have no real opinion on the capabilities of Australian politicians, but you look at, say, the ruling party in China, and the kind of investment and initiative and long-term research that they have put into blockchain technology over the last 5 years or so, and they seem to have a fairly comprehensive vision of how they see blockchain playing out as a strategic initiative for the next 10 years. Are Western governments falling behind?
I think they are, but I think that's necessarily a byproduct of the way the sort of state and federal systems operate, and that's one of the challenges in Australia. We've got a federal system, but we also have state systems that sit underneath. So it's very difficult to follow the lead of an organisation, not an organisation, at a country level, China, for example, because they are a top-down economy. They can dictate and determine what should and shouldn't happen, and then it is enforceable. Whereas for us, the state government of Victoria, state government of New South Wales, they have different agendas. So in order to coordinate them, historically, it's been trickier. This is where I think natural competition, and I think it lends itself to what people's view of tech and startup should be as well, which is there should be a healthy competition. We're a bottom-up nation when it comes to startup. We don't look to, and I don't think we should look to federal governments to pick winners in the technology space. I think you should look to organisations, VC investors, people that are willing to put the time in to create opportunities from nothing. And it's one of the challenges when you look to government. On one hand, people say it's not government's role to do this, but then they turn around and say we need government to fund it. So you kind of can't have it both ways. I'm comfortable that if we can create interest from a startup perspective, that it'll generate interest across the country, and ultimately that momentum and that competition is what will drive the development in this space. So it's very difficult, I think, when you compare to nations like China. You think about someone like the United States, for example, it's so fragmented. Their system is much more fragmented than our own. There are so many rules across so many states. The difference with the United States is if they kind of get it right, Andy, they'll win in a lot of respects. They'll get enormous capital inflows. Australia then sits between those two sort of timings, which is we don't have the Chinese ability just to say this is what we're doing, and in the US sense we're not as enticing and attractive as an investment. So it kind of means we have to move faster. We can't wait till everyone else gets it right, and I think that's part of the recognition that people have now, that if we wait until everything is safe and everything is right and every process is determined, then we'll be judged on our own merits. And traditionally, we're not the first nation. We're not a fast mover in that regard. We should be a fast follower. We've got the capacity to be a fast follower. And I think that's what the challenge is now for government and industry is this a role we want to play in what is ultimately the kind of infrastructure tech that can change everything. This is the promise, clearly, and the reason why I think we've all been so interested in it. It has the potential to change everything. It doesn't mean it will. So it's left to us to make that determination.
Yes, indeed, Steve. And of course, one of the challenges, as you pointed out, with, countries like the US, with so many states, and every state has its own different rules and regulations. So it becomes a really fragmented environment. So, and of course, that is the case all around the world. And then it really is a challenge to regulate open, permissionless networks that don't understand, these imaginary borders that we draw around countries. And it's just another problem that kind of makes this a bit of a vortex, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I think part of the confidence building, again, and back to that thematic, Andy, is when we're talking about blockchain and DLT, I know the DLT side of the equation is really boring for those that are really bullish on the technology and the implications of this very, very different world we can live in. Most people live in the blockchain DLT side of this equation. So that's where the conversation, I think, necessarily happens. And it doesn't mean that everyone who really understands what the promise could be needs to live there, but someone needs to be having that conversation. It's kind of, I described it yesterday, I was speaking to someone about it, and I said, some things you necessarily need to do because they create attention. They're good box office. They keep the conversation moving. And then there's the work that just has to be done that a lot of people don't want to do. And historically, I've been happy to have those conversations. And I continue to be happy to have those conversations because I think without that foundation, we just can't move to the next stage. I spoke on behalf of and in front of a pretty sophisticated audience last year. When I say sophisticated, I mean they represented a lot of really large Australian businesses. And their understanding and knowledge of the sector was 1 out of 10. And that's okay for me because my slide deck to present to them literally had virtually nothing written on it. I had one word on each slide because I recognize you have to calibrate the conversation in accordance with the room that you find yourself. So if you've got really notionally sophisticated people in a business setting who don't understand the space, then you've got to bring it right back to why they should start considering this thing. And then when you sit in a room with people who are talking about the development of tech that is super difficult to understand, and we're talking about things like snarks, and when you talk about the implications of all these technologies that mean cross-border challenges are diminished, but it's very difficult for governments to then follow the data across these borders. That's a different conversation entirely. So I'm always mindful of what that context is.
Yes, Steve. Well, look, it sounds like you're the right man for the job. You sound like an advocate for the technology and someone who is, prepared to support both sides of the blockchain equation, whether it's the open public permissionless chains or, the private DLT chains for government, for enterprise and everything that I guess is somewhere in the middle. So look, before we go to a break, why don't you just finish off with, what's your vision? What's your personal vision for Blockchain Australia?
The personal vision for me is that, one, those that have to be given confidence are given confidence, and that is governments and regulators. They need to recognise that the people who are giving this consideration, they can be trusted to do so. And I think that's an important process. It's pretty vanilla. It has to happen. So I'm seeking to do that. What I want to be doing as far as the skills is I want to encourage in rooms developers to be building things. I want projects to be happening. So that's a conversation I'm also having with universities and with accelerators and VCs, which is invest some money in this. Let's get this going. The bit that sits in between for me here, Andy, is industry, because in the last few years, the focus for industry has been things like, in a financial services setting, remediation, issues of risk and governance related to the Financial Services Royal Commission, things that are slowing down innovation in this country. For me, I would hope that if we can get budding VC investment, if we can get budding accelerator investment, we have government that says, yes, we're okay with this subject matter, it's important, then it puts pressure on businesses to step up. And I think that's what we need to happen in order for this to really kick off, because businesses at scale need to think this is a technology that they have to get behind, or their business models will be disrupted. And until they think they're going to be disrupted, they won't activate this conversation. So I'm trying to create an imperative on either side of them and ultimately cajole them, push them into saying, you know what, we better start giving this consideration, because if we don't, then the business falls over. Self-interest is the great motivator here for most people, Andy. So I'm trying to get people to be selfish and to think that maybe the comfortable lifestyle they've planned for themselves might have a few road bumps. And if they think that, then they'll tend to, I think, invest in the people and the technology that we're all so excited about.
Excellent, Steve. Self-interest is indeed a powerful motivator. It really is all about incentives. So give people the right incentives and they will follow their nose. Hey, let's go to a very quick break and then we'll come back and we'll have some fun, Steve. We'll finish off with the very famous Crypto Conversation Uptake round.
Whether you're an enterprise fund manager or a retail trader, buying and selling cryptocurrencies successfully requires price discovery you can rely on. Brave New Coin's liquid indices provide trusted US dollar prices for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Ripple. Featuring end-of-day or intraday outputs, you can count on the BLX, ELX, and XRPLX for accurate US dollar pricing for smart contract oracles, settlement price discovery, net asset valuation, and performance analysis. Visit bravenewcoin.com to find out more.
All right, we're back, listeners, and please excuse my voice. I'm slightly under the weather today, but that is okay because I am joined by Steve Vallas. Steve is the CEO of Blockchain Australia. And Steve, as you may know, I like to finish each podcast with a quick round of a rapid-fire crypto conversation hot takes. Are you up for it?
I am indeed.
All right, I want your hot takes, your hot fire. Take your best shot. Here we go. Steve, where do you sit on the Bitcoin maximalist to multi-coin opportunist spectrum?
I love Bitcoin, Andy. I love it. I was fixated with it. I love its simplicity. I love its elegance. I love its implications. So, save for, unfortunately, a lot of the vitriol for those that take a position that Bitcoin is the one chain to rule them all, I am very bullish on what Bitcoin is and all the things that can flow from it. So without an aggressive perspective, I'm right up there near a 10.
Oh, very nice, Steve. All right, well, what would you say is your firmest conviction crypto opinion?
At the moment, I think the main thing is that those who get it love it. And there are enough of us now to ultimately go out into communities and make some real changes. So I think the message is out there. I think it just now needs to be propagated.
Okay, well, Steve, look, I ask every guest this question, and yeah, it's slightly weird, I guess, given that, you know, I'm a New Zealander and you're an Australian, but who do you think wins the American presidential election 2020?
Given my history and understanding how social channels and the like work, Andy, I think Donald Trump will win again because he's got a motivated base. And when you have a motivated base, you get outcomes. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the particular party politics, I don't know. And most people, of course, in Australia, I think are pretty clear that Trump is not a good option, but he can motivate people through the channels. So the channels often win, even when the sentiment doesn't appear to be showing that's going to be the case.
Put you on the spot though, Steve. Given the opportunity, if you were actually an American voter, who would you vote for? Trump, Biden, or Kanye West?
I think given that we live in a simulation, Andy, I think the simulation's ready for Kanye, isn't it?
That is the only correct answer, Steve. You have passed the Turing test. All right. Hey, Steve, Bill Gates famously said we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in 2 years and underestimate what we can accomplish in 10. What do you think the blockchain space looks like in 10 years' time?
I think there'll be a very clear understanding that this is technology that has melded into the background a little bit, but is impacting a lot of verticals in emerging tech broadly. And this is part of the narrative that I'm starting now that says this is an IoT conversation, it's an ML/AI conversation, it's a quantum conversation, it's a cyber conversation. These are things that have implications for all of these techs. And I think there's going to be a slow and then ultimately a fast acknowledgement that absolutely all of those areas are impacted by the things that we've been speaking about in a blockchain DLT way.
Fantastic. I could not agree more. And look, on a similar note, Steve, William Gibson, the sci-fi author, he said the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Can you think of an example of the future being here right now, but most people just aren't really aware of it?
Well, I keep coming back to people, I guess, Andy. I'm speaking to people in government who are the most dutifully boring people you've ever come across, and they're excited about this technology. So that's where I see the future already being here. There are people in places you wouldn't expect who are already excited about what this technology might be. So I think that over time will become an in plain sight observation for people.
Fantastic. All right, Steve, we're almost done. Let's zoom out. What do you think is the long-term future for the human race? Do you see dystopia or utopia?
Depends what day you ask me, for the most part. I think, sadly, at the moment, we have a dystopian mindset, clearly. The world seems to be falling apart. I read something last night that said this is the beginning of the end of civilization. I think people are pretty resourceful. I think the reality is that there'll be a version of us that we live with, and it'll feel better once we're there. It's always looking backwards, it looks like it was better, and looking forwards, it looks like it's going to be worse. But I think generally speaking, wherever we are is probably the best place we've ever been.
Very nicely said, Steve. All right, finally, let's finish this off. What is your favourite science fiction book, film, show, or universe?
I think hilariously here, Andy, I didn't mind Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And part of the reason I liked the TV show is there weren't any happy endings. Something always went wrong and then there was a need to overcome them. So I guess I think about the rooms that I'm in where most of the time the answer is not yet, not now, or no. And I'm okay thinking, you know what, tomorrow there might be a better option that I can get. So that's the frame of reference for me.
Steve, can I tell you, you're the first person in, I think this is podcast number 54 for myself. You're certainly the first person to go with Buffy the Vampire Slayer for that question. But I love that answer, and I guess one of the reasons why is I have to admit that I myself have seen every single episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. My partner is a major Buffy fan, and early on in our relationship, we watched every single episode. I'm slightly embarrassed to admit, but yeah, good on you.
Shouldn't be embarrassed, Andy. There are so many pop culture references in that TV show that
yes, brilliant. I am enjoying the Buffy references. Thank you for that. Steve, we are done. Look, there's nothing else to say really, except the microphone is yours. Please take us out. Tell the people where they can go to find you on your various platforms, where they can go to get involved with Blockchain Australia, and hey, anything else that's on your mind, go for gold.
Terrific. blockchainaustralia.org is the website. The Twitter handle is blockchainoz. I'm active at Steve Vallas on Twitter as well. It's the easiest channel to get me on. I'm on social channels all the time, so I'm not difficult to get a hold of. And I would absolutely encourage and insist that if there is a willingness to participate in this sector, the government is listening at the moment. We do have their attention. I can say that happily, that there is an observation that this is technology we should consider. So let's make sure they recognise the weight of what this community is and can bring to the conversation. So I don't want people to say, I missed an opportunity. The opportunity is presenting, so we should take that opportunity.
Fantastic. All right. Hey, thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Boom, there you go. That was today's episode. Thank you to Steve Vallas. He is the CEO at Blockchain Australia. Links are in the show notes to the Blockchain Australia organisation. So if you want to get involved and fight the good fight and express your interest in any of those potential blockchain solutions as outlined by Steve, please do so. I'll also put a link in the show notes to that report that we discussed, issued by the Australian government. The report is, well, it's not a report, it's a blockchain roadmap. It's called the National Blockchain Roadmap, Progressing Towards a Blockchain-Empowered Future. And of course, that is something that we support wholeheartedly here at the Crypto Conversation. Anyway, that was us. That's all for today. See you real soon. See you next time. This was the Crypto Conversation for Brave New Coin.